Hi, good morning, classes, because several of you are going to see the same video. I hope this finds you well. I have set up my art room such that I can have a nice kind of whiteboard and try to go over how to outline our research papers today. So I have kind of made it up a little bit, but I pretended that I have a topic that I'm working on, and I've got the 25 different sources, which is what you're supposed to have. And I'm going to show you, now that we have those 25 things, how are we going to arrange them in a way that makes sense for kind of the research that you did? What's a good way to kind of organize it so that there's flow and it'll be easier to write later on? All right, so we're going to do that today. So what I've done is I've written things down. I like to have them down on paper, and Post-it notes or flashcards work really well because that way you can move them around. If you're more into the digital stuff, just do it digitally, that's fine, but I like having the paper copy to move around. So what I did is I just kind of put a summary of maybe things that I would potentially look at. So I pretended that my topic was the current pandemic, the coronavirus, and my goal is to kind of find out more about it and compare it to the SARS outbreak in like 2002, 2003. So on this one, it says compare virus symptoms and spreading. And on this one, it says compare government, hospital, and people responses. So this would be me kind of comparing the two. So let's say this is the research that I've done. What I could do is kind of put them in categories. So those are very similar, they're comparisons, and so what I decided is that's just kind of its own category. It goes together, right? So that's a comparison of the situations between now and the 2002. This one says animals versus humans, talking about the different kinds of coronaviruses. And then this says what classifies the coronavirus as a type of coronavirus versus something else, and how many kinds are there. And that to me is kind of a little bit about just the general history of coronavirus, right? So that's my category there. So I'm gonna set it up on the board, take a picture of it so that you guys can kind of see how I would categorize things first. So we wanna take all the 25 things that you found and figure out which things kind of go together, which have similar pieces of information, or which have similar ties. You know, what makes them stick together, if that makes sense. So hopefully I'm gonna organize this and it'll make more sense once I show you what it would look like if it's finished. So we're just gonna kind of play with some options for how we can organize this paper. I'm gonna give you the very standard one first. This is kind of what the fallback is, and most of my students end up doing. So usually the first thing that students do in the introduction is kind of always give the background information. So here's the background info for viruses in general. That kind of makes sense for an introduction because that's what the topic's about. So let's introduce the reader to what the whole paper is going to be about. And that way they're on the same page, they know what we're talking about, right? We could maybe also go into specifically a nice lead-in from viruses in general to general information about coronaviruses. So now we're talking about any virus, now we're talking about a type of virus, and that makes sense in the introduction also. That kind of leads us into the bulk of what we're going to be talking about. So the idea here is to think about, if this is the flow, what do we want that to go into next? So I have some options. I could talk about a comparison between the two situations, but that probably doesn't make sense yet if I haven't even talked about the situations in general first. So maybe the first thing I want to do is actually talk about the SARS outbreak. So that's going to be the first thing that I do after introducing people to viruses. That makes sense. And then maybe I want to go into some of that information about what did we learn from the coronavirus, right? But maybe I don't want all these things together. I can move some of these things around if it makes more sense later. So for now, I'll just put this here with the body. And then think about, what do I want to do next? So if I've talked about the SARS and maybe some of the lessons that we've learned from that, maybe it makes sense to go into the current coronavirus and talk about if we actually have learned anything and prepared for it from the SARS outbreak. Now it makes sense to compare them because I've talked about each individual situation. So it looks like maybe this is going to be a good flow for the paper. So I'll scoot these over because I feel like Bob Ross. I think next time I'm going to show you how to paint happy little trees. Okay, so that's pretty good. And maybe what I want to end with, a nice conclusion, is future predictions. So in that case, the purpose of my paper is for people to be well informed about viruses in general, how they work and how we treat them, and then specifically about coronavirus and comparing past situations so that we can think about things that have happened in the past and prepare for the future, right? So maybe the point of my paper is, hey folks, we need to pay attention to this so that far into the future, we don't end up in the same exact situation, right? So that's a decent flow for the paper. And I already have all my sources kind of figured out. And if I wanted to, I could go back and maybe move them around. So maybe some of these don't make sense necessarily in the places that I put them. Maybe I want to move one of these to another category or have it transition between the categories. That's totally fine. And that's also why I like to have kind of the nice movable paper version, because it just makes it easy to look at it and move it around. So that's one version. I'm going to show you another version. All right, so I'm starting with a clean slate and I'm going to go again, but this time I'm going to do things a little bit different. Sometimes in an introduction, you want to grab your audience. You want to kind of have a really decent hook. So what if this time, instead of just jumping into the general information about viruses, I actually went into the future predictions? What if I kind of use fear a little bit to have these different scenarios and predictions for what's going to happen into the future to kind of hook my audience? This is kind of stating right off the bat why you want to read this paper, because these are possible things that could happen, and don't we want to prevent these in the future? So maybe I hook them with this first. Then I can go into some general information about the viruses, and maybe still makes sense, I think, to add the background information and maybe the coronavirus information. Now what this does is this makes the introduction kind of long. That's totally okay. Introductions can be more than one paragraph. I know typically in the past we have learned it's introduction paragraph, 3 body paragraphs, conclusion paragraph. That's garbage, in my opinion. Don't use that method. Use the method where you're coming up with your purpose first, have all the information at your fingertips that you need, and then figure out how you want to tell the story. That's a much better way to write a paper. Writing papers is really hard though, so it takes practice and it's not easy. I think the outlining process helps you a lot with kind of looking at what you have and then thinking about how you want to tell the story of what your research is telling you. So now I have a really kind of long introduction. That's totally fine. Maybe how I want to start next is talking about, okay, I think I have an idea. I think what I want to do is end with, I think I want to end with all the things that we're doing currently. I want to have all of our current responses to everything. So I actually want to end here. I want to start with what could possibly happen. And then I'm closing with what we are currently doing. And this is the stuff that is kind of fueling those predictions. What we're doing now is how we're basing our future predictions. So it's kind of a nice closure. I'm going to end very similar to how I'm beginning. And this gives me a chance to refer back to that intro in my conclusion. So how do I transition here? If this is where I want to end, I know that I want to have kind of that interesting close. I need to think about the flow from here to here. So I go talking about, in general, viruses, and I need to get to what are we doing right now? So I think what would make more sense now is to talk about the SARS outbreak. And then what did we learn from that? So that I think would work for the body. I think what I'd want to do now, instead of the comparison necessarily being its own category, I think I might actually intersperse some of that in between this information and what we're currently doing. So maybe instead of keeping this the category, I just separate these things and I put them in other places, right? So that is potentially something I could do now as well. So that's kind of the outline method. It got me through hundreds of papers in college, and it works way better than just sitting at the computer and trying to just start an introduction. It's incredibly hard to do. So we're not to the paper writing part yet. I just want to see your outlines. So minimum, you're going to make one outline, and if you're going to type it, that's fine. You could either upload pictures or you could type it out. If you're going to type it, I need to see the categories. So either make it a different color, tab it, put the kind of bullet points so that they kind of indent, and that way I can tell what's falling under that category. And then also tell me what your plan is. So what things fall under your introduction category, the body category, and the conclusion category. You can have more than one outline. So let's say you come up with several ideas. Put all the ones up there that you want feedback on. I will look at all of them. I will give you some feedback or suggestions. I might ask you some questions or some clarifying things, and then check for your scores. Based on some of that feedback, decide which one you think fits the best for what you want to do. And then we'll move on from there. So the next step is going to be actually, after outlining, going back to our reference log and then figuring out how we want to use our resources. All right, I think that's it. There's so many birds outside, I'm getting distracted. Bye.